Okay, so with the question of how does my um, opening challenge codes or conventions, or how does it represent them? My genre was romantic tragedy, which um, for romance, the conventional narrative structure is that the narrative of romance, it usually follows a conventional boy meets girl setup, which in my film it does not follow that, because in the opening of the film it starts off as our protagonist is mourning the death of her boyfriend, which shows that it's it's a tragedy from the start because a loved one is dead, and it is not the kind of film that features the meeting of two people who falls in love. The characters were in love, but the death causes the protagonist to have to move on and go on. So in this film, the opening I did, the characters fall out of love eventually. The disequilibrium in this conventional narrative structure would be the death of the boyfriend, which propels the two characters apart because one is dead and comes back as a spirit, and the other lives on in the human realm, and which makes their love impossible to carry on. The another narrative structure is that the characters either end up happily ever after or they don't get back together, which relates to the tragedy part of the genre. In this case, my film relates to the tragedy part, which means that they don't get back together, and in the end, Leah actually finds another love for her. Um, Moving on to the tragedy, it is mostly realistic, which our film is quite realistic, and audiences can easily relate to it, which I think audiences can easily relate to it if they have lost a loved one before, and they can relate to the fact that their loved ones will never come back again. There is a plot twist. Our plot twist is at the very start, where our the our protagonist's boyfriend dies. So it would have been quite shocking to the audience. The emotional peak would be also in the first part of the opening, where the protagonist finds the ring that the boyfriend was supposed to give. Um, the storyline of our film features the protagonist overcoming difficulties, which is getting over her dead boyfriend and moving on and having a life. It involves death and social vulnerability, where the protagonists have to um, find some sort of peace in herself and in her boyfriend's death and live on. So in this part, we can see that the protagonist in our film is going on some emotional journey, which is, yeah, moving on and meeting the sadness and having to let go of the memories and the love. So I would say that our film follows the tragedy conventions quite strictly. Now, if we're talking about mise en scène, the location of our genre would typically be in a rural area, high schools, or urban. In this case, our film is featured in an urban location, which is in a condominium or an apartment, so to say. This makes it more realistic and more understandable and relatable to the audience. The props we used were flowers, which are conventionally used in romance trailers and films because they symbolize beauty and have connotations of love and affection. But in this part, we also had a twist. We used white lilies, which are normally used for funerals, and they represent, in a sense, passing on and a sense of regret as well, but also purity in death and in life. We use this to foreshadow the the next parts of the film, as well as the sadness felt by the protagonist. And this makes our film more realistic because it makes the audience um, even more relatable. The costume is typically casual or business wear. They are more realistic as opposed to fantastical or anything. I would say our film follows this quite strictly. We use casual wear and a little bit of business funeral wear in the very first parts of the opening.